Hi, it's Dwyer, dwyercrime.blog. Today is May the 15th, 2025. Let's talk about sex trafficking. Let's talk about the Diddy case. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, let me point out that the purpose of this video is to facilitate conversation. I want everyone watching this video to feel free to disagree with me in the comment section of this video. I see some of you have already. There's an issue with the definition of sex trafficking. Understand, Diddy is charged with 2 counts of sex trafficking. Let's talk about it. Right? In his trial, the legal definition of sex trafficking is drawn from the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. It is outlined in, let's give the statutory reference so everyone watching this video can look it up for themselves online. 18 USC Section 5091. Let me repeat that. Again, it's 18 USC Section 5091. This statute defines sex trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, where the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or where the person induced to perform such an act is under 18 years of age. Folks, a male sex worker who admittedly was a prostitute testified earlier in the Diddy trial. There was no testimony produced. It does not appear to have been the contention of the prosecution that he was under 18 years of age. There is no evidence that's been produced that Diddy's girlfriend Cassie was under 18 years of age. Right? So far in the trial, and the testimony may change later concerning other people, but so far in the trial, the principals involved are all over 18 years of age. Right? So understand, when you hear lines like, "I was young," and things like that, right? Nobody who has testified so far has been under the age of 18. So the focus here is on whether the sex that's been discussed so far was induced by force, fraud, or coercion. Let me repeat that. Was the sex here induced by force, fraud, or coercion? Now, when the sex worker shows up for the first of his multiple liaisons with this couple, right, Cassie answers the door. The sex worker said nothing in his testimony, nothing, that suggested that he thought Cassie was being forced to do anything. Right, folks? Let's go by the evidence presented. Right? The case starts out, it's a RICO case. The case starts out with a sex worker. You understand that There has to be a commercial sex act that's induced by force, fraud, or coercion. Right? The prosecution's sex worker who they presented did not give any testimony at all that suggested the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Let's be clear. Right? Diddy's girlfriend takes a stand. Now, she admits to having had an off and on again 10-year relationship with Diddy. Again, off and on again 10-year business relationship with Diddy. Right? Let's consider a couple of things. First, legally the burden of proof is with the prosecution. They have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They can't just make a showing. They have to convince you that there is no reasonable doubt regarding the showing they've made, that there's no other reasonable interpretation for the events. You as the juror can't sit there and say, well, that's one version, but wow, I have doubts, reasonable doubts, about whether that version is the way it happened. Right? If it's iffy, then the legal standard hasn't been met. The legal burden of proof hasn't been satisfied. Understand, in criminal cases, often criminal defendants don't take the stand. They're not required to. They even have rights against self-incrimination. The burden is on the prosecution to make the case. Now, Cassie testified. The 10-year off and on again relationship suggests to me, right, and I'm just one man out there. If I were on the jury, I'd be just one vote on the jury. But again, understand, these juries have to be unanimous to convict. Right? When I hear an on and off again 10-year relationship, that tells me from the alleged victim, the person who the prosecution is trying to convince you was victimized, not a swinger with later regrets. No, she was victimized at the time this took place. She has to be a victim of force, fraud, or coercion. The 10 years on and off again suggests to me that she was free to leave. Right? On and off again tells me that there are moments when it's off, when they're not together, where she's free to live her life. Let's talk about the first meeting. The male sex worker who testified. Let's talk about the first meeting he discussed from the stand. Now, the fact that it's just the first meeting suggests to me that this is an alternative lifestyle. Right? It suggests to me that he's a regular sex partner, or at least an ongoing sex partner of one or more of this couple. Right now, he did not testify that he was forced into sex acts. Right? You get the feeling for him things were consensual. He did not testify that he thought his interaction with Cassie was anything other than consensual. Right? He's a witness in the room, folks. The prosecution has presented you with a witness in the room who thought that his liaison with Cassie was consensual. Right? Understand what his testimony was. That Sean Combs is there. He didn't know it was Sean Combs at first. Sean Combs is off at the side. Sean Combs is not restraining Cassie. Cassie answers the door when the sex worker shows up. Right? Just to understand, Cassie's not restrained. Sean Combs hasn't put her in restraints. Right? Force, fraud. Did you get that impression from the sex worker who testified here? Didn't he portray the encounter as a consensual encounter? Folks, he somehow ends up with Cassie's phone number. Part of his testimony was that he tried to contact Cassie. He sent Cassie text messages to which she didn't respond. Right? Understand, this sex worker shows up for other liaisons. So the sex worker's testimony is not convincing of any conduct that was not consensual. If you disagree, let's dig into this case. Tell us about it in the comment section of this YouTube video. Let's have the discussion. Right? Keep in mind, you're not just sharing your thoughts with me, you're sharing the thoughts with other people who are watching this video. Let's have a community discussion. What is it in the male sex worker's testimony that suggested that his first encounter with Sean and Cassie was not completely consensual for everyone involved? Right? Understand too, he goes back later. Right? There are other times where he's with Sean and Cassie. Right? Is there any encounter that the prosecution's witness testified about that he thought was not consensual? Right? Now let's talk about Cassie's testimony. Now look, if we're third-party jurors, then we don't know Cassie. Right? We don't. Right? We don't know Diddy. If you're a third-party juror, right, if you're someone picked for the jury, you can't be friends with anyone. You're just looking at facts. Now, you understand that any time someone stands to financially benefit in a situation, then the jury has to consider the possibility of bias, right? The possibility of steering things in a certain way that will lead to the financial reward for the person. Now here, we know that Diddy paid Cassie a $20 million settlement. Now you can view that as, an acknowledgement that bad things happen. Right? Now let me point out, that the prosecution still has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. You could also view that as the witness, Cassie, having a profit motive. Can we be upfront about that? Right? She sued Diddy. She made allegations in the complaint. She received $20 million as part of a civil settlement. Right? She also wrote a book. Now, let's talk about her testimony. And let's be clear on it here. Her testimony is that she had an off and on again 10-year relationship with Diddy. 10 years. Right? Now, her testimony is troubling in that she talks about being physically beaten up by Diddy. Right? Let me repeat that. She talks about being physically beaten up by Diddy. Folks, here's a question to ponder in this case. Is there a connection between Diddy's domestic violence and the sexual encounter with the male sex worker presented by the prosecution to this jury? Right? What testimony did you hear that the sex worker showed up and Cassie was battered? Cassie looked bruised. Cassie had a black eye. Was there any testimony like that? Right? We know that there's a video of Sean Combs being physical with Cassie in a hallway of a hotel. Right? And of course, Sean Combs later made a video where he talked about how he did some things that he regretted. Right? We'll fill in the blanks on that. Maybe he's discussing the battery in the hallway. Right? Are you certain that the hallway incident has any connection whatsoever to any sexual encounter that either Sean Combs or Cassie had? Right? Cassie, right, again, she's received $20 million and she's written a book. Right? Cassie contends that she was trying to leave a private freak-off when Diddy accosted her. Right? The idea was that Diddy wasn't going to allow her to leave the private freak-off. Understand the importance of that testimony. That's the prosecution's attempt to show force, fraud, or coercion. Right? Cassie's testimony is that she tried to leave, Diddy follows her into the hallway, and Diddy then batters her. Right, folks? If you're a juror, you need to go by the evidence. The prosecution has presented a sex worker who apparently was not involved in any way, shape, or form with whatever was happening in the room before the hotel hallway incident. Right? We have no evidence, none, other than Cassie's testimony, and it's early. It's early in the trial. Right? The prosecution will have ample time to present you with evidence. But we have no evidence other than Cassie's statements that links the hallway video incident with a freak-off. None whatsoever. In fact, there is a possibility that during their 10-year on-again, off-again relationship, right, as Cassie herself said, she wanted to please Diddy. Right? Diddy was the first adult romantic relationship that she had. Right? That's her testimony. There is the possibility that during that 10-year period of time, these two got into arguments unrelated to any sexual activity. Is the prosecution going to present testimony from the people who were in the hotel room that Cassie left immediately before getting physically roughed up by Diddy in the hallway? Right, folks? The prosecution has already presented one sex worker who really had nothing to say regarding the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Nothing. Right? They just pulled in someone who said, hey, I'm a sex worker. I got called by this couple. I went over there. I saw a guy pleasuring himself. I fooled around with Cassie, got her phone number, texted her later. Isn't that the male sex worker's testimony? And that he met up with this couple on an ongoing basis after the first meeting. Right? That's the testimony. Folks, that testimony doesn't prove to me that there was force, fraud, or coercion. Right? Let's concede here. I'll concede it. That Cassie gets physically assaulted in the hotel hallway by Diddy. What's the evidence? Tell us in the comment section, please. What's the evidence other than Cassie, who's received $20 million? Right? Other than Cassie saying that she was leaving a freak off. Right? What's the evidence that Cassie was leaving a freak off? Has that been proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt? If the prosecution has the phone logs from Diddy's accounts, right? Well, they should know who Diddy called before that freak off. Right? Can we agree that if the only people in the apartment, not the apartment, the hotel room, were Diddy and Cassie, before Cassie leaves the apartment, Diddy follows her and physically assaults her in the hall? If the only people in that hotel room were Diddy and Cassie, then that's not sex trafficking. The physical assault is a physical assault involving two people in a relationship. That's domestic violence. That's not sex trafficking. Right? Can we agree on that? So if we're in the jury room, if the prosecution does not present the people who were in the room with them, right? Keep in mind too, there's a hotel camera. Right? We see what happened in the hotel hallway. The hotel surveillance footage should show who is entering and who is leaving that room, shouldn't it? For the prosecution to make its case, and understand, if they have this evidence, then I'll concede their case is made. If they have evidence and present it of who was in the room, what was happening in the room, right? If sex workers are in the room and Cassie tries to leave the room and then gets physically assaulted by Diddy in the hallway, I'll concede that meets the sex trafficking definition. If the prosecution can't present that evidence, then let's just say that hotel video is unrelated, or at a minimum, the burden of proof has not been satisfied, linking that hotel video to any alleged sex trafficking. Can we agree on that? So let's have an open mind. I have my doubts about this prosecution, because if they were going to present evidence of someone in the room who was involved in a freak-off, and then Cassie tried to leave the room, the prosecution would have started with that evidence. Right? In a case like this, where Diddy was presented with a plea bargain offer, and he turned it down, right? Prosecutors will try hard to make a strong first impression. You don't save that information for, the second or third week of trial. You lead with your strongest punch. Because if it lands, right, if the defendant who turned down the plea deal is sitting in court and then realizes that, the jury is engaged, the witness was effective, you don't have a real counter for it, right? Someone says, I was there. You understand, wow, the hotel surveillance probably shows him or her entering the room. Here they are in court. They have given damaging testimony to me. I can't unring that bell. Right? You see it on these Law and Order Dick Wolf shows. Right? Someone is mid-trial, and then, their lawyer says, hey, okay, you made your point. My client's ready to talk. Right? That offer you made earlier, we'll take the offer. Right? Folks, they didn't lead with anybody linking the hotel video to a freak-off. They didn't even lead with Cassie. They led with a male sex worker in a interaction that the sex worker thought was consensual. Right? I mean, let me say too, I'm concerned over the blurring of the interactions. Right? If they're consensual interactions, why are we hearing about them? Shouldn't the testimony be limited to interactions that were not consensual? Right? If the prosecution is just trying to, give provocative testimony in a prurient type of way to the jury, right, at this early stage of trial, then that tells me there's not a lot of meat on the bone here. Right? So again, folks need to realize sex trafficking involves force, fraud, or coercion. Right? Let me also say too, Cassie testified that she was an artist on Diddy's label. Right? She testified that Diddy threatened to drop her from the label. Right? The inference is that there's a quid pro quo here. You have to engage in sex acts in order to further your career. Right? Now, folks, what other evidence are they going to produce of that? If that's the extent of coercion, right, then I don't see how that reaches the proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Right? That sounds like, you know, how do I put it? Um, Labels all the time drop artists. Right? Your album's not a blockbuster. Um, the label can drop you. Right now, you have to ask yourself, do you believe, based on Cassandra's testimony, that Diddy said to her, you must engage in these sex acts at this freak off in order to stay on my label? Right, folks? There's nothing in writing. Right? The prosecution hasn't presented any eyewitnesses. They haven't produced any ear witnesses. And I have to say, and I know this is an unpopular position, right? You're dealing with a witness who, it could be argued, had a financial motive. Right? You know, let me also say, too, that when you hear that someone has an on again and off again 10-year relationship with someone, right? How could what Cassie has testified be true? I believe it needs supporting evidence. If, when she's not with Diddy, she didn't go to the National Enquirer, right? She's free, right? By her own admission, the relationship ends at times, right? She, wrote a book later. Why didn't she write a book then? Right? Why didn't she sell her story then? Again, she wrote a book later. Right? She put all of this in a criminal complaint and filed the complaint. Right? I can tell you, in the state of California, filing a complaint is privileged under Civil Code Section 47. Right? Now, this is a federal case. Right? It doesn't involve that statute. But just understand, even if she had a contract with Diddy, if Diddy is forcing her into private freak-offs, right, and she were to then file a complaint against Diddy, right, Diddy couldn't allege that the complaint that she filed didn't have some legal immunity. Again, it's California Civil Code Section 47. Right? Why didn't she sue Diddy early on? Let me ask another troubling question. The sex worker the prosecution presented, this isn't even a defense witness, talked about how he would text Cassie directly. Right? Do you believe that Diddy would endanger his music business, Bad Boy Records, by beating up Cassie and having her, black and blue, engaged in sexual activity with third parties who Diddy barely knew? Right? Understand, there's a risk that a sex worker shows up and sees Cassie and she has black eyes. And then the sex worker sells the story to the National Enquirer or goes to, some newspaper or something like that. Right? And so, let's just say the prosecution's version of events is one version. Right? It is one version. I'd like for the prosecution, if they're going to make these serious claims that there's sex trafficking, right? And by definition, it would involve force, fraud, or coercion, right? I'd like for the prosecution to back up their claims, right? Not present a sex worker who was called by Sean and Cassie, has an interaction, and thinks it's all consensual. That's your lead witness? That's a witness who's one of the first witnesses you call? And then, of course, your main witness is someone who's already received $20 million. Those are my thoughts. Again, the statute is 18 U.S.C. Section 1591. Again, 18 U.S.C. Section 1591. Right? We haven't yet heard of anyone who was in the room when Cassie leaves the room and Sean follows her into the hallway and there's a physical interaction. Right? Are we sure that there was anybody else in the room? Right? Why would I, at this stage of the trial, give anyone, Sean Combs or Cassie, the benefit of the doubt in a case involving a burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt that belongs to the prosecution? Right? Trust no one, follow the evidence. We know the interaction in the hallway took place because there's a tape. What else do we know? Should we be assuming anything else? If the prosecution does not present the people who were in the room. Right? Now, I'm expecting, as this case goes along, based on the press reports of the case, for them to make a showing that there were people under 18 at a Diddy freak-off. Right? Folks, don't you think that there might have been people under 18 at the Playboy Mansion when Hugh Hefner was alive? Right? The real question really should be, was Diddy aware that there were people under 18 at a freak-off? I'll agree. Diddy is finished on that part of the case if you find out that, if there's a witness that says that they told Diddy they were under 18 and Diddy said, come anyway. Right? But here again, folks, I'm not going to speculate about what the prosecution has to show. They're the ones who need to make the showing. In my eyes, they haven't linked the hotel video to a freak-off. In my eyes, I still haven't seen any evidence of sex trafficking. Right? This sounds like a couple. Sometimes couples argue. I'm not here to rationalize domestic violence, but let's just say swingers can have arguments that are unrelated to sex. I look forward to your comments in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.